Hey, good morning, everybody, wherever you are. Sun's rising somewhere, and
Mm.
we're meeting today again. Counsel of the Third Way, New Elder Wisdom podcast. Once again, he's here. He's with us. We're together, looking for that third way, looking for those tensions to confront and learn from, and nourish ourselves in a way we can be courageous and move forward in times that are at least unsettling if you're paying any kind of attention. And thank you for being here, my brother. It's good to see you. Aloha.
Aloha, bro. Yeah, stoked once again. I always enjoy these conversations, man.
Yeah.
And I hope everybody listening gets a lot from it too, because I believe we're like on that, we're on that third way path, which very few are accustomed to, but is so needed. So yeah, just really, stoked on this one too, what we got coming up.
Yeah. How you call it? Kuka kuka?
Kuka kuka, it's like good conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have like Vala'al, which is kind of like gossiping around. I
Vala'a.
have Vala'al, yeah. Yeah, it's funny how we have words for different ways of speaking, right? It's similar to like in English, it's like straight speech, or are we talking like, business, or we're talking like poetics. And Hawaiian, it was always like coming to a serious conversation, or are we going back and forth with like a kakalaleo, or it's like this is kind of off topic, but do you know like flitting or flitting?
Mm.
So I guess back in the day in Europe, I'm not sure which countries, but I know like Nordic cultures did it a lot too. I'm sure all of them did in some shape or form, but two people would kind of like take digs on each other
Mm.
using rhymes and poetry and like insulting one another and stuff, kind of like rap battles, but they
Yeah, the
call it
original
flighting. But
rap battles. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
blow off some steam.
yeah, exactly. And it was just like public, and like that's what everybody did. But it was like the OG like rap battles.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm sure the griots had something like that too
oh yeah.
in Africa. I'm just not familiar with it, but I'd like to learn.
Yeah, they say that's why they took away their talking drums, because they had all the poems written to let people know who's coming down the road, and a lot of it was like from a jester's point of view. Like they would
Mm.
make, they made, I forget some about the khaki shorts that the English colonists wore, and the way they
Oh,
made fun
really?
of them, yeah,
And they
with their
would
with their sunburned legs.
they would sound it on the drum.
Yeah, yeah,
And people were like, "Oh, haha,
yeah, yeah,
I know that one." That's funny. Oh
yeah. The
man.
battle of words, man. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it seemed like they. Well, we'll get to that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good conversation. How do we utilize the word, right? Because it seems like so much of what we've approached is in a way despelling, right? Breaking spells of consciousness, ways of thinking, ways of feeling, ways of doing, and understanding them within ourselves and those around us, and asking questions of it. And it's been powerful to see you amalgamate your thinking through your processes and experiences. And wasn't that long ago you started using this term regenerative leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, when you dropped that, I was like, okay, he just opened a big door again. We got something to create within now, and
Yeah.
co-create and cooperate within, and look for this third way, this
Yeah.
tensioning that's needed. So yeah,
Totally.
talk about that some, your path to that amalgamation of word, thought, and doing.
Um. Yeah. So it's interesting when when I think about regenerative, there's what comes to mind a lot of times for me is like generative is an energy where it continues to move, continues to provide and to show up. And so in our society, we look a lot at resourcing. And so when we resource from something, we apply it and objectify. We apply that word to objectify materials like oil, for example, or fuel, or like mining or fracking. You know what I mean? We need to get these resources. But as we know, those get depleted. And when you deplete the resource, it's no longer a source. The well goes dry. So what are we doing in our extraction? what are we doing to our resources when we see them just as things to be used up till they are depleted, and then we move on to something else, and then we keep extracting. So that's what I see with a lot of leadership styles, right, that we've been accustomed to, or I have been, right? And like a lot of it was more transactional and like short-term thinking and disconnection from actual people. It was more about having a top-down hierarchy. Pretty much for the end goal was, as long as I'm in leadership, I will have control and I'll receive all the benefits in my leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw that a lot in whatever, politics, different communities, different, even like social groups. Like if you're like involved in any kind of like movement methodology, it's always like there's just one charismatic guy, and it's like if he's not getting people involved in doing this, and it's always going back to him or her. And so the curiosity for me was like, what kind of leadership if we made it into a regenerative one, right? Where we can regenerate the source itself, regenerate the person, regenerate the community. And so when I thought about that, I was like, okay, if we're going to move from a place of transactional, then what's transformational? From short term to long term, from one person to generations, and rather from ego to be more eco and collaborative.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I looked at regenerative leadership, I was like, okay, this is what nature wants. Nature always is going to regenerate. She's always going to provide that radical indigenous hospitality. So how do we as humans move that into our leadership? Is there wholeness? Can we honor this integration of mind, body, spirit, and emotion, cultivating that inner alignment and that authenticity so we can show up fully as human, especially in this time with technology moving so fast? Or are we just playing the role or looking for titles for validation? And so wholeness was key in regenerative leadership. So was the interconnection, recognizing that life entirely is deeply, deeply interconnected. And our decisions as leaders should ripple out across that, across, the human being, the people, through the planet, through, those elements, earth, wind, air, earth, wind, fire, water, and ethereal, spirit. And how do we do that for future generations in mind, right? So taking our thinking into 7 generations, if you want to put it that way. So a lot of the regenerative leadership understanding that I had in the beginning when cultivating this message was coming from the traditional teachings that I had received from a young age. But I'd never had like a real structure for modern society to make it a bridge. So I was like, let's do it this way. Let's see if we can do living systems thinking, moving beyond just the mechanical, which is cool, and organic mechanics are great, but how do you do that understanding an organizational, like living ecosystem, not just things to control or machines, but stewards that can be on these patterns of life for health, flow, and emergence, and being in service to that, asking ourselves questions like, how can this choice create more life and not less? Can we move from the extraction to contribution while at the same time receiving what we need and what is necessary so that healing can come, not just the harm and the nourishing for people in place? So that inner work has a lot of outer impact when we look at it from a place-based understanding and being culturally attuned to indigenous wisdom, to have ancestral connections, so that this ecosystem stewardship doesn't just look like, here's the return on investment if we do everything right. And that's kind of where I was at with it. So some of the key kind of principles of the regenerative leadership, as I was saying before, is, the wholeness, living systems thinking, the interconnection, legacy, generations, connection to ancestry, and then service to life. There's probably like 7 things in there. Yeah, that's where I was coming from with it. It's like a remembering on how to belong again, and rebuilding trust in that belonging so we can revive this culture and this kinship worldview. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, what I've been hearing from you is really, it allows the old teachers to teach again. It allows the structures that have been right in front of our faces to come out of the background. I often was like thinking about like old cartoons about how the background would kind of stay stagnant, and I was like, oh, that's kind of white thinking like that. It's just this kind of like stagnant piece behind that everything happens in front of.
Yeah.
And so we have these examples, you know, and these old understandings, which you're bringing forward through the missions of Makoa Quest and now Academy as well.
Mm.
And so it is an elemental life. However, there is this expansion bridge, you know, and you know, I do see you as someone trying to build a bridge with it. So, you know, break down one or two of the structures as the teachers come forward and out of the background, as the elemental life shows us a way into regenerative leadership.
Yeah. I like the example that you used as the background is kind of being still and everything is happening in front of it. Because in Western thinking, that's kind of the idea. Like if we were to show kids that grew up in a Western educational model, most times when they look, say, like at a picture, or if they're looking at, say, an aquarium, right? You go to an aquarium,
Mm-hmm.
the kids are more likely going to point out, that's a big fish. Like, look, big fish. And that's like the main thing.
Yeah.
But then if you look at kids that come from like a Eastern, let's quote it like that, educational model, they're going to look at the context of where that fish is coming in from. So they'll notice first, like, oh, look, there's seaweeds, there's certain air bubbles, there's large groupings of fish somewhere around, and then the big fish will show up later. So to me, that's kind of like the idea is that the way for us in this Western thinking for more wholeness is not only to emphasize what we imagine as being bigger is better and faster, stronger, you know, all of that in the context that we have in our minds, which comes from a culture of dominance. And so it's happening in a subconscious way. But when the person can actually see the context of what they're looking at, say, so much is literal, right? Like we write down words, we read books and all those things, but we don't actually meet the author. And if we knew who the author was and then we read their books, the impact of that book would be way better. And so that's how I imagine regenerative leadership is. Let's get to know the creation first. Let's see those that have had experiential knowledge through the stages of life in such a way that they could provide for the younger generations. And how do we create spaces for that? And so that's an emergent quality that I think helps those that are older getting into stages of life of maturity and seasoning, where we should allow that elder wisdom to come through. And it's not really about the number of the age or how many years you've lived. It's just what you've done with them. Right. So in that context, it's like, say you have somebody who is a professional, licensed healthcare provider, you know, they're like an MD or something. Knowledge wise, it's, yeah, we need that. We need to have certain structures that then give people credentials and credibility and vetting and filtering through those years. And it's in that modality. Of course, you're going to go to a medical doctor rather than somebody off the street who's telling you, you know, they can just live off of breathing air. Yeah. Cool, bro. You
Yeah.
know, that's some good science maybe for you, but is that applicable for everybody? No. So now when we look at the medical professional, how do we treat them to bring them into community outside of just having that single form identity that validated them so much?
Mm-hmm.
Can they also too use that knowledge in a way that's cohesive to community building and for generations to come, and not just to siphon people back into a system that keeps training them into that Western conditioning to only see this one thing as being the preeminent above all understanding? And that's what indigenous wisdom does. And so when I look at my teachers, they don't have medical degrees, but they've got, 50 years plus committed to ceremonial life. And I feel like that is just as valuable for the human soul, just as valuable for our children, just as valuable for older folks too, who never had that in their life. And those are the kinds of teachings we need to bring forward with this model of regenerative leadership. Merging the gap between our ancient bodies and this, kind of alien foreign environments that we've created, so that we can come back into holistic thinking and not needing to measure it all, but seeing how it unfolds. Because I haven't seen that yet. I haven't seen, this ways of Western models, right, where we have academia sitting at the top of the hierarchy, and then indigenous wisdom keepers being held in that same place. And I believe once that happens, that's the regenerative leadership that we're going to see really come forth. And I believe it takes men like us that can think that way, that have, learnings and experiences too, to bridge that gap. And we can bring forward another culture, right? Because I'm not trying to emphasize, oh, everybody needs to become native. That's not what regenerative leadership is about. But everybody needs to know how to be at home and to belong and to grieve and to have all those things that require emotional regulation, ecosystem thinking, getting away from like toxic work culture and, bringing people back into, this is what you need to do to really take care of yourself, not just so you're optimized, but so you can feel yourself in your body and make that heart and mind connection and understand that there's so many things outside of what we're capable of knowing with our little human minds. That's kind of how I see it.
Beautiful. Yeah, here we kind of, not kind of, we see that there is this missing element of elemental elder wisdom coming down, and there's a great searching, a great longing, and then this old model comes in of taking and commodifying and commercializing, and yet we're looking for teachers. And in what you are saying, I just keep thinking of oaks. I grew up around a lot of oak trees, and there would be these mast years, they call them, where the trees are just loaded beyond loaded with acorn. And we are being asked to survive and thrive in this trickle down environment. And then we turn around and see the oak tree and say, that's a lot of acorns all at once. Can we begin to emulate those type of things, that dispersion of resource in a way that knows that our own regeneration is in our ability to give, in our own ability to, be in chronic potlatch, maybe. Merciless potlatch.
Merciless. This is just it. I don't care if you've had enough. There's more.
Yeah. It also makes me, when you speak of the emergent, what's missing and what is foundational still in your own learning. And I think of the stories you told me about Aluwalu and the circulation of teachers there. And I forget, was it 8 or 9? How many?
8.
8, yeah. So that eternal cycle of regeneration represented in the numbers there. But am I remembering correctly? Would there be a circulation of teachers through that and a rhythmic way?
Yeah. So each teacher was expert or master in a certain discipline or craft. And when it came to certain places like Oluwalu, we also have out here, Kealaka'i Honua is another place that I'm familiar with. They would offer different things. So on the other side of, Mauna Kahalawai, which is West Maui Mountains, holding a house, right? Meeting house of the waters. One side, which is Oluwalu, was more dedicated to the spirituality of the people. It was a sacred refuge that people could come and they could learn. And if they had done something, right, that they were now persecuted for, right? Maybe they broke one of the tapu, one of some of the social laws, right? The kanabai. Then they could come to this place and redeem themselves. It was almost like I could compare it to how people would go to like a Buddhist monastery in ways.
A retreat.
Right? Like a retreat. Yeah. Like a retreat. And then you would learn from say like a specific, individual that was really good at understanding right relationship to people. And they could see those patterns, and then they could look at the person and say, well, these are some of the things that have come up, for you specifically that you need to address. And then they would go to another teacher that was good with somatic, right? Kino, with the body. And they would say, well, these are some of the works that we need to do with you. Now you need to go on a 4-day fast, and we're going to have you be lomi massage for 4 days straight, day and night. And it's just like, whoa, like what kind of a learning do you receive just from that touch, but then also from the in-depth, right, intensive work that's happening. It changes the whole function of the body, or the structure of the body to function with sustainability, right, longevity. Now, if you look on the other side, where you have Kealaka'i Honua, which means like the leader of the world in one poetic way, they specialized in learning the ecological systems from the ocean to the land. And then what did you do as agriculturalists? So there was some who were really good at making the lo'i and growing kalo and having the fish in there and everything was working. You would learn that. Then you had the fishermen, how you make net, how you do diving and cultivating the reef, as well as harvesting like seaweeds. So each teacher held a special spot and you would cycle through them depending on, what was needed. Or many times people would go as like a halau or as a group, right? As a cultural school to learn from these teachers. And it would be seasonal because we have wet and dry. So different seasons would require a different spiritual connection to all these things. Everything was spirituality. It was all practical. It wasn't like, this is what you do to be spiritual by going to church on Sundays. So the regenerative style was like, we can't just have one person as the dominant leader. We needed to share that responsibility, knowing at certain times there's one who was the most called for the people. And they would be there at the top for a bit. And then they would switch.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot about how we often describe ourselves as expert generalists and not really so much out of choosing, but it's for me, it's a feeling of, it's like a requirement almost in order to be able to express within these pillars, which, our work together and with others has begun to identify that are so essential that it sounds like a place like Aluwalu was holding in one way. And then, will you say the name one more time?
It's Kialakaihonua.
Yeah, so the center of the world, and how that was rooted so much in the everyday sustenance and rhythms of cooperation, of nourishment, as a laboring, but also a community binding force, and how so much of what is asked of people is the exact opposite of that, to go into the cubicle. And then we have, we'll organize ourselves around the fluctuation of currency that we'll never see, touch, or experience in a way reliant on the, on the labors of those we will never be in relationship with. And it's funny, one of the terminologies that I think you struggle with sometimes is the use of the Western mind, right? It's like, well, whoa, if there was a West, there were actually some cool ass people in the West.
Yeah.
And that were running, things in good rhythm and time for millennia. And the idea of America, sometimes you're like, to me, that's the American mind. And, I've been thinking more about the origin, or, the origin of that name, Americo Vespucci. He was
Marigo, yeah.
Yeah, Americo. He was an Italian propagandist, really, who he wrote a lot and actually sold people the idea of coming largely through a well, basically telling a lot of tales about indigenous people,
Okay. Yeah.
and particularly what the women had to offer. Definitely like pornographic descriptions. And so much of what I see of this so-called Western American mind it's like a pornographic conception. It's this, and it is based on the newsletters and writings of Americo Vespucci, who was a propagandist, pornographer, and con man extraordinaire. So it is, Stephen Jenkinson also utilized the term so-called Western mind, and so I do want to be careful with that as well. But as we might explore later, there was, other darker forces at play in the West too. Prior to Captain Cook and such, and his cohort of thieves, murderers.
Which is a trip too, because like even how you're saying it as well, I do struggle with that Western mind, because I know there have been and I've been in touch with it too, of the real roots of the esoteric schools of teaching that, whether you call it the spiritual traditions of Gnostic Christianity, for example, or the Mediterranean animism or Druidry, in the places of the Celtic, Norse, Greek mystery schools, for example. But then it's like everything that had happened, to our ancestors there, they were eradicated systematically. And that indigenous, like European wisdom that was held by so many women, herbalists, midwives, witches, they would call them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oracles. They split spirit and matter, and chose to, like what you're saying with Amerigo, chose to eliminate that knowledge and that teaching for the proposal of a better future.
Mm-hmm.
And so then now all those esoteric teachings get pushed underground and associated as pseudoscience, because now the soul is no longer part of the conversation, right? And nature becomes an object. And so, yeah, I do struggle with that. You know, I don't like to just label Western people as being crazy or off. I think I'm crazy for being indigenous, to be honest. Like,
Yeah.
whoa.
Yeah, that's like Red Light asked me this morning. He's like, how you doing? I'm like, oh, you know, hovering between the line of brilliance and insanity. And he's just like, oh, so just like any other day. Like, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, bro. And even too, like what you were saying before about, you know, just expert generalists, you know, to me, that's such a important part of our understanding when we talk about like labels or identities, you know. And I guess I kind of say it like this, like, this is something you always remind me of too, is like specialists, you know, they know more and more about less and less until they know everything about nothing. And then I think about, you know, the expert generalists, how we like to, you know, proclaim ourselves. And it's like, yes, we know less and less about more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And we see threads of the things that are going around and want to find that wholeness, you know, together. And I think that is key to the regenerative model, is we can have science and spirit and make a spirit science. We can have the ancient, the modern, and the future, and have an ancient future. We can have business as ceremony, not just business as usual. And we can innovate in those ways. And being an expert generalist is what creates that. And even when we think about, you know, certain tribal peoples, they were able to translate a lot of these things together, not from conquering, but from like direct relationship. You can call it trade, you can call it bartering, all these different types of ways. But what they were doing was they were exchanging in cultural knowledge and memory with each other, so that they get
Emulation.
familiar. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that this morning. Even, you know, there were 4 of us working out. Everybody's a little tired, and like how the movements of others kind of spread through the group. We began to emulate each other, and actually we all, because none of us really wanted to push, and then it had become something larger than ourselves. It became a conversation in motion.
Yeah.
You know, we're like, all right, yeah, let's go sweat, you know, let's get some prayers up. It's a good day to do it. Even though, you know, I wonder what this general existential crisis of today is about. I even had a few other people reach out that seemed to be in a place of like, damn, you know, which is I think a pretty sane response to what we've begun to boil down to as the ever presence of savagery on the planet, and
Yeah, man.
being willing to look at it, examine it, experience and feel it, and also to look at the word itself, where it comes from, how it's been used. And, you know, you've been, I've, you know, I call it the biannual war against Christianity on the Kale show over there on Instagram. Fucking Christian values. Where are they? I'm still waiting for those to show up. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like an important part of the conversation, is something that has to be addressed. And I mean, you spoke to a little bit about the old occult in Europe being pushed underground, forced underground.
Yeah.
There's actually a lot of different streams, because there were also societies and sects that purposely went underground to do what they were going to do, which was not always the greatest. And
No.
I've really been diving deep into this woman, Gigi Young, puts forward a really pretty brilliant history of occult science and the occult arts. And, you know, the history of, you know, I am always looking like, where did it start? Where is all this fucking barbarism come from? Like, why is it here? Why is it so prevalent? Why is so much blood on the ground? You know, and what do we do with it now, right? So much of I believe what we're dealing with when we're working with individuals and groups is just a ripple, an echo down the canyon of time, of savagery, barbarism, by what I've begun to identify as two unique streams of it. One is the Abrahamic brutalities, the Abrahamic savagery. And this can really be traced to Babylon, to the Babylonian occult, which was extraordinarily masterful. When we think of the heights of the Kanaka magic and the ability to read everything around them and know the original languages in the Babylonian kingdom, this was a time where that magic was then corrupted and can be thought of as the elements being enslaved into controlling others. And so the old occult arts that had come through the Eastern and Western streams and really centralized in the Middle East, one can see through the occult histories what began to happen and how the arts there. And we're always talking about this elemental life, coming back to elements, but we have to think about how we come back to them, because we can't come back to them again in a way to control others, because it actually literally enslaves them and de-evolves them into what can be considered a subnatural state, because that is not what the elemental ancestors and beings are here to do. But they become vessels for a darker type of consciousness that can sweep across the world. And this impulse of brutality, cannot only be seen and isolated to Europe. It was in Asia, it was in the Americas, and there is a history of brutality, in what I would consider the other stream, which is, indigenous savagery against the people of the surrounding communities, and how that played out. And where did that thinking come from? What happened? Was there something similar? Were the elements now being enslaved to do the biddings of those who would control others and extract from them beyond what was needed, for harmony to arise? And I often think of the Dene story about the Anasazi, and the archaeologists and the who are the ones that study the culture, the professors of culture. They're always saying, well, we don't know what happened to the Anasazi, and the Dene are like, we do. They were fucking flesh eaters and slave traders, so we killed every last one of them. And they talk about that prior to Spanish conquistador culture coming through. And so where does it come from? The corruption of the elemental, the greatest of ritual of which is atomic weapons, subatomic, below what? Below nature. To reduce to the point of nothingness that is not regenerative, and the void that gives everything from a womb space of infinite blackness, but of infinite expulsion, right? And so these histories and being willing to look at them and look at the world around them and put them in the context of dark occult science, I think is actually really beneficial. And I've come to think about this term of techno-satanism, and what that exactly looks is the corruption of the elements to deceive, to cast spells, to control and corrupt. On the black rock, the black cube, the Abrahamic brutality can also be seen as the cult of the black cube, which is not a natural form. Is a subnatural form until it is allowed to unfold into the Merkaba. But all of them worship on the black cube, and we can go into that a little bit. But what do some of these things bring up for you?
Yeah, brother, this is great. Like, this is when I really tap in with you, and I learn a lot. I'm like, whoa, this is where the contact that you've had with all your years of experience with these teachings and these religions, and understanding their histories and the sources of their own migration and what happened during that time. And then when you're talking about the brutality and the savagery that had happened across the world in many different tribes or societies, whether they were advanced or inferior, however you want to see it. the corruption of the elements to turn them into an unnatural form, like you're speaking about. The first thing that comes to my mind is the Wetiko. And in many ways, you can understand it as like the malignant ego, or, the understanding that it's like taking too much, right? It's the psycho-spiritual disease of the soul. And there's that spirit that comes in of selfishness and greed and the consumption of life force itself, which then lends towards what you're speaking on about the corruption of the elements. I think, and so then it's like this collective psychosis that comes, because Wetiko is a word that comes from, I think, like the Northeast. I think is like, it might be a Cree word or Algonquin. Can't remember. I know in Lakota we use it too, but it's like that virus of the mind that convinces, a person and then eventually a people that they are separate, and that it tricks us into consuming and controlling and conquering without seeing that by doing those things, we are actually destroying ourselves. So when you bring up the story of around the Dine and Anasazi, it's like sometimes it needs to be eradicated in such a way, but then it's like, how do you look at that and perceive it, right? What happened? Because even a lot of occult symbols were being used with the Nazis in the American psyche. We see them as the worst people ever because of what they've done, but that they also had occult symbols, and they were also eradicating a certain thing too, not justifying it, but I'm seeing that's the brutality and the savagery that had come in a similar fashion with indigenous people too, where they committed this violence against each other because there was that parasite of a mindset that was feeding on the fear, and the dominance and all of that. And they used their ancient teachings of the elements, which is so powerful, like how you had referenced, like, with Kanaka people, right? If I could just speak on that, is yes, we have a deep knowledge of, intimate relating towards the elements, our place to people, everything above and below. It's like hermetics, right? It's like as above, so below. We had that, but then we also had an infection, of a virus, which I call chiefdoms. The chief comes, and then now he's the most powerful one, and he's able to manipulate the masses on, this is what you need to do for me or I'll kill you. And by creating people that are just farmers to then accumulate and store food, now he has a specialized unit of an army, and now he can go commit war on everybody. And we can praise these chiefs by doing these things that created our society, or we can see them for what they really were, conquerors and dividers, and using these ancient teachings and these magics for their own selfishness, which I believe is what it is. I don't think, we as a people now, with what we know and what we're able to do in this time, should ever go back to something like that. But that's what comes up for me. Mm-hmm. But you spoke on the thing too, where it's like the techno-satanism. Yeah, the adversary, the embodiment of that kind of rebellion against sacred order, I guess. But I want to let you talk, because this is like stuff that I'm super interested in. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, I can speak, from the understanding of Western occultism, that war itself is always based in deception, and that war itself is ritual. It is ceremony, and that the prophecies of, there are different lines of dark occultism throughout Europe, like the Hand and all these different societies, and they surface and go underground, surface, go underground.
Like Freemasons.
Yeah, and also those who all split off, and who the Freemasons are. Like I consider the Mormons to be a bastard offshoot of the Masons. But the Masonic thought, the Rosicrucian thought, the individuals that kept the knowledge became greatly, greatly infected with the virus that you're speaking to. And one of the things that we can see, you just put out this beautiful piece called prior to the split, before the split. Before the split. Yeah. And this can be traced very directly to the Christian occult schools of the earlier teachings, which can be seen, as a fork of two streams. We recognize there are two Christ consciousness streams the one Yeshua bore and the one that Magdalene bore, and they came together. And then you have Constantine that comes along, and we call the Magdalene stream the Sophic, or the divine earth wisdom stream, and those come into a central stream, right? That create a true split, one that is unified with what is being received. And that was, deliberately murdered. Constantine and his hordes, chased the Gnostics deep into Egypt and murdered and burned books and whole libraries, and chased off the feminine teachings of the esoteric Christian consciousness. And the corruption began. We need to begin to pinpoint things. 325 AD, so-called.
Right.
A great movement of ritualized warfare was brought forward in the name of an unseen God. Now you have a book. Not only did God write it, but you're not even allowed to read it. You got to talk to this line, get in this line, and put it away private in a box. Take it away from the natural world again. And so these impulses, we see it as that the earth itself is like a burial ground for fallen spiritual beings, the so-called rebellious ones, and that they are concentrated graveyards, and that the dark occult humans come forward, and blood released on those soils allows that consciousness, that impulse to come forward.
Right.
And some of our biggest prophecies about the Antichrist is there's like a tipping point of amount of blood shed, ritualized blood shed, that is then catalyzed so that the Antichrist can come forward, right? And so, I hear you, I see you, I listen. It's like, Christian, what? What values? What is the value? What is going on here? And people need to understand as they try and move towards a regenerative spirituality of communal self, of relational merit. That we're I believe we are living in a gigantic techno-satanic ritual of bloodshed in order for a certain consciousness to come forward that has been growing, right? As you tell from your stories, whether it was chiefdoms, the same thinking creeps in. And how do we find hope in a time of that? Again, looking forward, looking back, which is it? How do we become present with those things, take the time to grieve, and find ways to, off gas with the stones, and come to magic in a new way, really, because this is really a conversation about magic, about the ability to control thinking, which is to control one's perception of value. So it always comes back to the elements, and what which the masters of your lineages knew was that these elemental beings come with gifts that require responsibility and an understanding of reciprocity and group beyond self. So I think that can be why it can be so frustrating with all this personal development. And it's like, okay, why? And it's not to criticize, it's just to see, like, where can we take this? Okay, are you clear enough? Are you free enough of your wounds to begin to relating towards a solution that requires a lot of us? To break the spell. That's a lot.
It is a lot. It's got me going. I'm pinging, bro, all over. I'm like, what the heck? No, but no, I understand it too, because like the way that I've heard you speak on this, right, is like like if you were to talk more about the Satan or the satanic, right, because in many ways that's about inversion, right? And I kind of have like a path towards this one, but I wanted to hear what, if you were to describe the techno-satanic ritual, what would be some of like the examples?
Right. And so Satan's a slippery slope because in many ways he's an amalgamation of all tricksters and
Mm,
so-called devils or inverted light beings, right? Like you said, there's
mm,
this turning in towards self of a spiritual being. Um, so the two distinct streams that I think about are the luciferic or the loosening, the sulfury, the dreamy, the passions, the
mm,
desires, and then the aromatic, the hardening, the controlling, the warlike, the hardened deceit of
yeah.
law.
Mm-hmm.
When the virus, when Wetiko becomes law, those kind of things.
Mm,
But it
mm-hmm.
is an inversion. Like I think of someone, a god like Quetzalcoatl, who
Mm,
is said to be born of Venus, right?
mm,
And so those who study occult science know that that means that there's a virgin birth present, in associating with Venus, because Venus is a divine goddess who is
yeah.
capable of these things, and not just once over in old Bethlehem.
Mm-hmm.
But there, through Quetzalcoatl, we can trace the history of a beautiful utopian society that then all of a sudden inverts itself into a great bloodletting society. So you can see this in relationship to like the relationship between Venus and Mars, the warrior, and how
Yeah.
he is willing to go into the sub parts of the earth to be with her in infidelity and to bring great shame to her. Right. And so how does shame come about? How do the impulses of greed and hatred play out through the gifts of someone like Quetzalcoatl, who's like, here, have some language, have some beautiful ability within your crafts, have some,
Yeah.
this feminine ability to create and hold culture in a way that bubbles up like a spring.
Mm-hmm.
But then when that gets commodified and again corrupted to control, and I would butcher the name, but there was one particular priest who made himself emperor,
Yeah.
a Mayan priest, and he basically eradicated the worship of the divine feminine and hyper focused on the power given through Quetzalcoatl, and it was then inverted
Mm,
into a great ritualized bloodletting. And then it's like, people talk about Lucifer. It's like, well, you got to thank you, Lucifer, too, and also
mm,
be wary of him whispering, because he only really says one thing to you, which is, it's you. It's all about you.
mm.
You're the one, and you need that. Wouldn't that be nice? Another plume, right? Another
Yes.
feather in the cap. But these are, I think, more easily thought of as impulses of thinking, feeling, and doing, how the human translates the gifts of the greater, broader realm of beings from Maui straight on down the line of all the ones that have been with us along the way,
Right.
and now they want Odin back. Right, you can that's one of the big ones you can see in like Katy Perry. She's always like the Odin eye and like the flip,
Yeah.
like she's ridiculously occult and very satanic in her
Yeah.
presentation of the culture that she brings forward.
Yeah.
So it's also a
The
satanic
fembot.
impulse. The fembot, exactly. Exactly, right? Dangerous territory that we're going to get into with Dr. Zachnik
Yeah.
in a couple of weeks
Oh, yeah,
here.
yeah. That's gonna be good.
We got to look at this AI,
Mm-hmm.
which again, creating merely from data,
Yeah.
which can only exist in the three-dimensional human experience, and the interpretation of the 3D realm into
Mm-hmm.
data. Can sentience come about, or is that a vessel for an inversion impulse of the human purpose, which is to
Mm.
interact, connect, be in vulnerability, raw authenticity with all light?
Right.
So, what are the things that pull us? off the third way, these impulses, right? This is another way to think of the third way, that which is loosening, that which is hardening. Okay, what do I get too loose in my things, or do I need structure, which is part of regenerative leadership, which we see in the forest, right? Or do we become too hard in our thinking, right? We got to bring some water in there. We're going to return to the water, and then what arises, that fire in between. I mean, we can basically look at the world stage and be like, maybe man needs to be grounded from fire for like 3,000 years. Like, you don't get any fire.
Oh no.
So what is that heat, that warmth that radiates in first? That's that's level 13.
Level 13. Come to the Hawthorne ceremony. You'll get there eventually.
Yeah, hopefully I will too with you.
Yeah. Dude, that's awesome. Yeah, and I just wanted to contribute to it too, because like I see the techno-satanic ritual, every time it's like, an entertainer, having a concert, and you see what they're doing, or even in their music videos. And then you also see that like happening with certain influencers online. It's just like peddling dopamine, they're not offering anything. They even call it, they have a word for it, like brain rot content. I was like, damn. And like it's super popular with people that like they can just be fully entertained, no need to wonder where it's coming from or why. There's no further questioning. It's just like, here it is. And it's just like constant imagery that's just there to kind of like entice, and I don't know the word, but like
stimulate,
seduce, stimulate and seduce this part of us. And then now also in that way, it's like this ritual has its own like priests, right, in the entertainment industry, also in
celebrities,
the billionaire that's making rockets, to go to Mars, and like these architects of these artificial intelligence systems and how they're using it for surveillance and like all this stuff. I was like, yeah, that is the techno-satanic ritual, right? Like at hand.
To create a world within a world.
Yeah. And so I wonder too, is like for us in the third way, as you said too, is like that authenticity for that relationship in all things human and all things other than human, more than, even superhuman at times, right? In the sense of like,
you better believe it.
Yeah. The returning back to this embodiment from the disembodiment that technology is taking from us. And can we still hold on to ourselves and create a culture from that when things are going awry or being inverted, and not replace our souls with like data, or like marketing is the new myth kind of thing,
Yeah, it absolutely is, right? It tells a story of self. Look at you in this and how it hurts. We have something for that, right? Why go through the ordeal? That's very Luciferic from our point of view,
Yeah.
To soften the ordeal in a way where the ordeal is never approached,
right,
but ever present.
Yeah.
Right. And that's so much of what, the indigenous life ways have shown me. It's like, oh, there's the ordeal. That's the way to go.
Yeah.
Let's go over there.
Yeah.
Let's see what they're up to there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. See it, experience it, learn from it, and adopt it, or be adopted by it, And that was key too. 'Cause like, even you bringing up the energetic around Venus and Mars, and shoot, I had a story, but I forgot it. But the thing was that with Venus too, as the what do they call, like many times like the morning star.
The morning star, the bright morning star. Who else they call that one?
Yeah, isn't that and that's a trip, because she's also the divine birth, right? She came from that virgin birth, and many of that kind of teachings, I guess it'd be like the Gnostic one, Gnostic teachings. It teaches about how she was born from this naturalness that didn't need anything else. And there's like a scientific word for that too, where it's like self-generated into creation. The Sophia.
The Sophia.
Yeah. And I think like so many of the stories, right? Even in Christianity with Jesus, or Isis with Horus, you know, in many ways, it's like there's a calling back to that, right? That needs to happen. But there's an inversion with the fembot, you know, so I kind of get like confused, like, because creation can just happen because that's what she's going to do. The womb of life will bring forth reality, right? But she's also the goddess of love, which is like sacred intention. So like I'm like, man, this is a big thing that they're doing.
Yeah, again, it all boils down into love, which is neutral magic, right? Because it can be utilized in any way the human being chooses. It can be used to create and control through the, of course, that's not true love, but the distortion of love can be utilized that, but it's still a great force that needs to not be held onto. And I think that's what, you know, so many people are afraid to let go of the love that is, to make room for what's, you know, going to bubble up on the next round, for fear of losing again, because we have lost so much along the way. And, you know, yeah, we see it playing out, you know, why they want to go to Mars so bad. What is the impulse of consciousness that is available to them and being motivated within them, which is, again, to me, a perversion of the warrior who has ceased to protect and come to parasitize. So it's a big old can of worms we opened up here today. The council, the council of third way, and you know, but it, you know, I think it does identify that like primal motivation that I think maybe we felt even as babies. You know, like, whoa, we're here now. Something's going on. That's hard.
That's right.
And it's off. You know, and you know, I'm being given these gifts in this line of ages, but also there's this too, which is the repercussions of what? Chiefdoms? We don't know. Who's chiefdoms? And so the reconciliation that we are hoping to formulate, you know, as we move is, I think, based in the recognition of some of these things we've been talking about today.
For sure.
You know, we have the ability to, you know, see it turn to compost, because blood meal is good for corn as it is for dark ritual. And so see, we always have that one in the end over them, because we don't need anything other than this vessel we agreed to perform the magic that disrupts the cycles of Wetiko, which is, you know, love, presence, and charity of spirit. And so if we can begin to cultivate that one more and more in the corporate spheres, and wherever we go, invite us. We're available.
Yeah.
Kinda,
Totally.
if you're lucky.
If you're lucky. If you're lucky.
So yeah, brother, you know, I know you got probably a full day ahead, and maybe there. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the people?
Yeah, this is just an enlightening conversation. I have a lot to continue to metabolize and digest from this one. It put me in a good place of understanding that beauty is power. It really is, and the creation of that. And along comes, you know, a culture that is so needed for our people, you know, worldwide. Ones that want to honor the unseen forces in ways that they don't need to turn into hungry ghosts all the time. So now they're feeding on us by our constant desire to want to get ahead or be somewhere else, or create things to make our lives easier and comfortable and convenient and instantly gratifying ourselves, which then makes us skip the ordeal. And so I hope that when people listen to this, they feel a deeper call for themselves to understand these rituals and these ceremonies and these prayers and these songs, so they can continue to be in connection to spirit and ancestors and land. And so we can nourish the future instead of take from it.
It's time.
It's time.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here again, brother. You know, it's as always, really. Good kuka kuka here on the Council of the Third Way. So thank you, and we talk soon, okay?
Yeah, love you,
All
Ron.
right,
Mahalo.
love you. Oh, that's